continuing our discussion of Egypt during the war period from last segment. If you recall, going back to 1942, Nahas Pasha declared war against the Axis, even though the Egyptian public were overwhelmingly opposed to it. They, like the rest of the Middle East, badly wanted to see the British to be defeated. 2 years later, however, the British knew they will win the war and will defeat Germany, so they were no longer concerned about the Axis making any inroads into their colonies in the Middle East and Africa. So they no longer needed Nahas Pasha, so in kind of tune with what they normally do, they dump him. And the Wafd party was now in deep trouble because Nahas Pasha was no longer prime minister. To gain its lost credibility, Wafd becomes fanatically anti-British. And the moment they become anti-British, once again, they become very popular. But the British were still too important, and they still had troops in Egypt. So it wasn't as yet possible for the Wafd or the Egyptian to genuinely feel that they have defeated the British. We move forward next to 1952. People begin to revolt and begin burning every building that was British owned. So everyone knows that a revolution of some variety was in the making. In the meantime, the British still couldn't bring themselves to accept that they were going to get kicked out, and they wanted to hang on very desperately. It is at this point that the United States pretty much told them that they cannot and they must leave. Also at this point, the newly created CIA begins to focus on anti-communist military officers in the Egyptian army. On July 23rd, 1952, a coup is executed. The real leader of that coup is Gamal Abdel Nasser. One thing to remember about that event is that it is dubbed as Egypt's second revolution. Because the uprising was a popular uprising to begin with, so it started as an uprising that was very popular preceding the coup. Also, the fact that Egypt's monarchy was overthrown, so Egypt now has become essentially a republic. Therefore, you could pretty much call the coup as the kind of a continuation of that revolution, given all these features. So it is called the second revolution. Remember, the first revolution was in 1990. CIA actually did give support and money for the coup. It was not anywhere as heavy involvement as was the case with Iran. But as you can imagine, this is not a good way to become popular and achieve legitimacy if you're going to receive money from the CIA. And for that reason, probably Nasser at first was not very popular. In fact, the students who were very active in the university and in politics, for example, were much more pro-Wafd, which, if you recall, had become much more anti-British than they were pro-Nasser. So initially, Nasser was not as popular a leader that later on he will prove to be. So therefore, in the early 1950s, you will see that Nasser and United States actually become very close allies. We truly liked him in that early period because he was first willing to suppress the communists. He was strongly anti-communist, and he was willing to suppress the Akhwanis who had tried to kill him. He wanted to establish law and order. Remember, we wanted stability in the Middle East because of our fear that out of chaos, out of instability, the only beneficiaries are going to be the communists and the Soviet Union. So we liked that part of Nasser's rule. He also showed every sign of knowing how to handle his own people. All of this made us like Nasser, and a lot of people in the state and Defense Department supported him. I have discussed this in much greater detail in my manuscript, therefore I will forego getting into those details in this lecture. But here's a puzzle for you. Why did we go from helping Nasser to come to power in 1952 to wanting him to be deposed, really going after his head in 1956? So what happened in that 4-year interval in which we first loved Nasser? We thought he was a great ally to have in the Middle East, that strategic reason. By 1956, we wanted him dead. The answer to that puzzle is this. Primarily, but certainly not exclusively, the answer is Israel. We're going to discuss that in much greater detail later on. But to get there, to understand why we ended up becoming his enemy, we first need to understand Nasser's growing attraction to pan-Arabism, to Arab nationalism. And to do so, really, we need to digress a little bit into Egypt's demography. Put simply, given Egypt's very large population, there is always a serious shortage of arable land to sustain that population. So 10 years after the Aswan High Dam was completed in Egypt, there was still shortage of agricultural land. The demographic pressures to feed Arab's largest country were a chronic challenge for any Egyptian leader. The problem, if it remains unresolved, is such that a decade later, Egyptians can see that they will be worse off than they were today. So that means there is therefore a serious need on the part of Egypt, especially at the time of Nasser, for some kind of an external help. And I say at the time of Nasser, but most of you know this trend has continued to this day. Egypt relies on external help today from the United States to the tune of something like $3.5 billion. Now, put yourself in place of Nasser. If you ever get Arab unity, if you can round up the Arabs, the natural center of that unity will be the Nile Valley. And Egypt is the most important and largest Arab countries. So if the Egyptians are to have money, especially from the rich brothers in the Persian Gulf sheikdoms, they be able to industrialize, they be able to mechanize their farming, and then Egypt will be able to make progress and stay ahead of that demographic pressure and time bomb. So the logic that I just outlined for you was clear, and Nasser fully recognized that. So what that meant was that in the long haul, Egypt's survival requires Arab unity. So even though Nasser was a devout Egyptian nationalist, he chooses pan-Arab or Arab nationalism instead of Egyptian nationalism as his calling. So throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the main show in the Arab world is Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. Also, we need to remember that Nasser was now trying to recover from the overthrow of the popular party, the Wafd. Remember Wafd, as soon as it splintered, it began to be very anti-British. And the 1952 coup ended up actually removing the government that was Wafd. So it's not a good way to be popular if you had overthrown a populist party. So for Nasser, in order to recover from the coup and the taint of CIA, he does this by becoming even more anti-British than the Wafd. And as soon as he takes that position, you begin to see that people that were rallying for Pan-Arabism are beginning to get notice of Nasser and are attracted to him. I should point out that many of the intellectuals who were Arab nationalists came from a liberal democratic tradition. Nasser, however, did not care a bit about democracy. So the liberal democratic elites who were also attracted to Arab nationalism were really never attracted to Nasser per se. At this point, I kind of want to give you the lay of the land in terms of the elites. So you will see, just like as we saw in the case of Iran, the A's are your traditional anti-change elites in Egypt. The B's are liberal pro-change, and they are by far the largest group. So this is eerily reminiscent of the situation around the same time in Iran. And then the smallest group are the authoritarian modernizers. These are pro-change, but they don't really care about democracy. They want to change. A lot of them are communists. The core of Arab nationalists comes from B, and as you can imagine, there is a problem for Nasser because these people are liberal Democrats, many of them, and they don't like Nasser's dictatorial style. So that's the kind of elite picture that I wanted to point out circa 1950s at the time when Nasser is taking over. Next, I want to talk about a very important period, and that is the year 1955. The year 1955, by any standard, was a critical year for the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also for Egypt as well. In that year, Moshe Sharett, Israel's prime minister, is replaced by his close friend, David Ben-Gurion. How did that come about? Ben-Gurion and Sharett were very close friends, and both were equally attached to the state of Israel. But there was an important difference between these two men. Sharett had a very complex view of the Arabs. He was in a position to be able to empathize with Arabs. And he believed that Israel must make peace with the Arabs. It's good for Israel's survival in the long haul, as well as for the region. So he believed that Israel must learn to live with Arabs and work out their differences. What was happening at the time was that Israel was becoming subjected to daily raids by small groups trying to infiltrate into Israel. Sharett regarded the daily raids that occurred into Israel, mostly by the way from the Jordanian soil, as at best, or at most I should say, a nuisance rather than a serious threat to Israel's existence. By contrast, Ben Gurion had a very, very different image of the Arabs. He viewed Arabs contemptuously and very much in the stereotypical manner. Like many imperialist Englishmen before him, Ben Gurion felt that the only thing that the Oriental people understand is force. So when you deal with these lower races, the only thing they respect is power and strength. And once you teach them a lesson using your power, they will learn quickly and will become compliant. Therefore, given that perspective, given that view of the Arabs, Ben Gurion believed that a series of violent reprisals against the Arabs would bring about a halt to these raids. And after all, from his perspective, what these raids were really all about was to test Israel's will and determination. Those are important words. For example, when you read Henry Kissinger's book about 1957 book about U.S. foreign policy and nuclear weapon, there's all this talk about the U.S. must show will and determination. These are code words that are used that you're constantly being tested by the diabolical enemy whether or not you have the will and determination. Therefore, from Ben Gurion's perspective, the tactic of massive reprisals seemed entirely reasonable to deal with Nasser. Also, I should again call your attention that those who hold the imperial stereotype with respect to Nasser regarded him as, if you remember, as an agitator type leader in a country with little public opinion and little sense of nationalism. And yet, if you look at the history, both of these premises were false. There was public opinion and there was nationalism. And so this attitude, by the way, is not something that occurred several decades ago in the 50s. In fact, the reason I keep bringing it up, it is alive and well today and was explicitly, not implicitly, explicitly advocated by two academics by the name of Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ejami right after 9/11 when they met with President Dick Cheney about how one should deal with the Arabs after 9/11. So 9/11 became a test of our will and determination to stay in the Middle East. The only thing they told Dick Cheney, and he wholeheartedly accepted, he already believed in it probably, was that Arabs respect power and strength. So once we show power and strength, things will go our way. In the meantime, going back to Egypt and Israel, in the meantime, because of these daily raids, what's happening is that Israeli public were getting increasingly angered over the raids. So we have this debate over disproportionate response between Moshe Sharett and Ben Gurion, and the implication is one way to make it disproportionate is to engage in collective punishment, a policy that to this date Israel still practices. So in 1955, Moshe Sharett left the government. Ben Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, came out of retirement to deal with the problem of continuous raid. So February 28, 1955 is another defining date. I remember I said 1955 was a very important year. So this is one of those elements that make it so important. Israel raids the Egyptian garrison in the Gaza Strip and slaughters every one of the guardsmen. The event is called Israel's Gaza Strip raid. It is worth noting that the most recent Arab raid had come not from Gaza, where the retaliation took place, but had come from Jordanian soil. So there was really no connection between the latest raid and the latest raid into Israel and the retaliation. The choice of Gaza was deliberate on the part of Ben Gurion and his cabinet. The idea was to humiliate Nasser. So the event that is known as the Gaza Strip raid really represent a turning point in the Arab-Israeli relations. In the manuscript, I talk about all these behind-the-scene events going on in which the U.S. was trying to get the Arabs and Egyptians, the Egyptians and the Israelis to agree to a peace with all kinds of incentives, but this raid really torpedoed everything. The fact of the matter was that after the raid, Nasser was humiliated. His position both in Egypt and in the Arab world as the leader of Arab nationalism necessitated a vigorous response. So what does he do? He comes to the United States, asks for arms from us.